In the gleaming corridors of O'Hare International Airport, Captain Maya Thompson's 4 golden stripes caught the fluorescent light as she made her way to her connecting flight, a journey that would unexpectedly challenge not just her patience, but the very dignity she'd earned through 20 years of commanding the skies. Despite her impeccable uniform and 2 decades of experience landing massive aircraft in the world's most challenging conditions, what awaited her in first class would prove to be more turbulent than any storm she'd ever navigated. As the only black female captain among thousands of pilots at her airline, Maya had faced prejudice before, but this time, something inside her stirred differently. Would she finally break her silence and confront the exhausting burden of being both a pilot and an unwilling educator about bias? Or would she once again swallow her pride for the sake of professionalism? Let's stick around to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe. Captain Maya Thompson's eyes scanned the array of instruments before her, their gentle glow illuminating her focused expression in the darkened cockpit. The Singapore-Chicago flight had been challenging, pushing through 14 hours of varying conditions that tested both skill and endurance. Her dark fingers, steady and sure, made minute adjustments to the controls as she guided the massive aircraft through its final approach to O'Hare International. Wind shear alert at 2,000 feet. First Officer James Chen's voice came through her headset, professional and calm. Adjusting approach parameters. Maya nodded, her short, neat braids catching the dim light. At 45, she'd handled countless difficult landings, but each one demanded the same unwavering attention. The Chicago skyline glittered beneath them, a maze of lights piercing through patches of low-hanging clouds. Weather conditions were less than ideal, typical for a Chicago winter evening. Ground control. This is Singapore Airlines 237, beginning final approach. Maya spoke into her headset, her voice carrying the natural authority that had become her trademark over 2 decades in the cockpit. The response came back crisp and clear, guiding them toward runway 28R. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner responded to her touch like an extension of her own body. Earlier in the flight, they dealt with a minor hydraulic system warning that had required extra attention, but Maya's experience had helped them handle it smoothly. Now, as they descended through the turbulent Chicago air, that same experience guided her hands. 1,000 feet, James called out, following standard procedures. Maya could feel the aircraft buffeting slightly in the crosswind, but her adjustments were automatic, almost instinctive. The runway lights grew larger, more defined. 500 feet. The familiar countdown continued as Maya maintained their precise glide slope. Despite her fatigue from the long flight, her mind was sharp, focused entirely on the task at hand. 50, 40, 30. The automated system called out their height above the runway. Maya felt the familiar surge of satisfaction as the main gear touched down with a gentle bump, followed by the nose while settling onto the tarmac. The reverse thrusters roared to life, and the massive aircraft began to slow. "Nice landing, Captain," James commented as they taxied toward their gate. Maya allowed herself a small smile. After thousands of landings, she still took pride in executing a smooth touchdown. The post-flight procedures were second nature. Shutdown checklist, system checks, documentation. The ground crew approached the aircraft with their usual efficiency, though Maya noticed a few surprised looks through the cockpit window, looks she'd grown accustomed to over the years. Not everyone expected to see a black woman in the captain's seat of an international flight. As they completed their final checks, Maya felt the full weight of the 14-hour flight settling into her bones. Her uniform, crisp at takeoff, now carried the slight wrinkles of a long-haul flight. But her posture remained straight, her movements deliberate and professional as she gathered her flight documents. "Captain Thompson?" A young voice caught her attention as she stepped into the terminal. A member of the ground staff, barely in her 20s, stood nearby with undisguised admiration in her eyes. I want to say it's really inspiring to see you in command. I'm starting flight school next month." Maya's exhaustion lifted slightly. These moments, these brief connections with the next generation, made every challenge worthwhile. "What's your name?" she asked, pausing despite her fatigue. Sarah, Mom. Well, Sarah, Maya smiled warmly. The sky's waiting for you. Study hard, stay focused, and don't let anyone tell you what you can't do. She saw her own younger self in Sarah's eager eyes, remembered her own dreams and determination. As Maya walked through the terminal toward her connection flight to Denver, her wheeled pilot's case clicking softly against the floor, she reflected on how far she'd come from her first days in aviation. 23 years in the industry had taught her that every flight was more than just a journey from one point to another. It was a statement, a small victory, a step toward changing perceptions. The terminal buzzed with its usual activity. Passengers rushing to gates, announcements echoing overhead, the smell of coffee wafting from nearby cafes. Maya checked her watch. Her connection to Denver would board in 2 hours. Enough time for a much-needed coffee and a moment to gather her thoughts before the next leg of her journey. Little did she know that the upcoming flight would challenge her in ways that had nothing to do with weather conditions or technical difficulties. Sometimes the most important battles weren't fought in the sky at all, but right here on the ground, in the everyday moments that shaped the future of aviation. O'Hare International pulsed with its characteristic rhythm, a symphony of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and the constant murmur of thousands of conversations in dozens of languages. Maya moved through Terminal 3 with the practiced ease of someone who had walked these corridors countless times, her pilot's uniform drawing occasional glances from passing travelers. The late evening crowd had thinned somewhat, but the terminal still hummed with activity. Near Gate K7, a group of children pressed their faces against the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching in wonder as a United Airlines jet taxied past, its wings gleaming under the airfield lights. Their excitement brought a smile to Maya's face. She never tired of seeing that pure fascination with flight. The familiar scent of brewing coffee drew her toward the Blue Sky Cafe, a quiet corner establishment she'd frequented during her layovers. Behind the counter, a barista with electric blue hair and multiple ear piercings greeted her with recognition. Captain Thompson, the usual? The barista, Jamie, according to her name tag, was already reaching for a large cup. Please, Maya nodded, appreciating how Jamie remembered her preference for a double-shot Americano with a splash of almond milk. As Jamie worked the espresso machine, Maya noticed her glancing at the captain's stripes on her uniform with particular interest. My sister just started at Emirates Flight Academy, Jamie shared, carefully measuring the espresso shots. She mentioned there aren't many women in her class, let alone. She hesitated, clearly searching for the right words. Women of color? Maya finished with a gentle smile. No, there aren't. But that's changing, slowly but surely. How's your sister finding it? Challenging, Jamie admitted, adding the steaming water to Maya's cup. But she's determined. Actually, she'd probably flip if she knew I was talking to you. You're kind of a legend in her flight forums. Maya accepted the coffee with a small laugh, though the word legend made her somewhat uncomfortable. It triggered memories of her own journey, and suddenly she was 22 again, stepping onto the tarmac for her first flight lesson. The flashback was vivid. The weight of the headset, the overwhelming array of instruments, and the encouraging voice of her instructor, Sarah Martinez. Don't let them see you doubt yourself, Sarah had told her that day. In this industry, confidence isn't just about flying, it's about surviving. Those words had carried her through countless challenges. The skeptical looks during job interviews, the passengers who'd requested different pilots upon seeing her, the subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination that peppered her early career. But there had been allies too, mentors who recognized her talent and fought for her advancement. Tell your sister, Maya said to Jamie, pulling out her business card, that if she ever needs advice or just wants to talk, she can reach out to me. Sometimes knowing you're not alone makes all the difference. Jamie's eyes widened as she accepted the card. That's wow. Thank you. That would mean the world to her. Checking her phone, Maya saw several messages waiting. One from her sister asking about Christmas plans, another from her mother sharing photos of her nephew's school play. A text from her wife, Elena, reminded her to pick up milk on the way home. That wonderfully ordinary request grounding her in the midst of her transcontinental day. The weather update for her Denver flight showed clear conditions, a welcome change from the Chicago turbulence. Maya took a moment to review the flight plan while sipping her coffee, mentally preparing for the next leg of her journey. Near gate L12, where her Denver flight would depart, she spotted her crew gathering. First Officer Michael Chun was already there, reviewing documentation with his characteristic thoroughness. Flight attendants Lisa and Carlos were engaged in animated conversation, their laughter carrying across the terminal. As Maya approached her crew, she felt that familiar surge of pride and responsibility. Each flight was a chance to prove something, not just about herself, but about what was possible for everyone who'd been told they didn't belong in aviation. The weight of representation never truly lifted, but over the years, she'd learned to carry it with grace. Her phone buzzed with another weather update, but Maya's attention was drawn to a commotion near the first-class check-in counter. Something in the air had shifted, a subtle tension that her years of experience had taught her to recognize. As she watched a well-dressed woman gesticulating animatedly at the gate agent, Maya had no way of knowing that this passenger would soon test everything she'd learned about patience, professionalism, and the power of turning confrontation into education. The Denver flight would be more than just another journey west. It would become a testament to how far the aviation industry had come and how far it still needed to go. The boarding process for Flight 1876 to Denver began smoothly, with the familiar choreography of passengers finding their seats and stowing their belongings. Maya stood at the cockpit door, greeting passengers as they entered the first-class cabin. The space gleamed with its subtle luxury, 12 pods arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration, each featuring rich leather seats and polished wood accents. The evening light filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow across the cabin as passengers settled in. A businessman in 2A was already engrossed in his laptop, while an elderly couple in 3D and 3F quietly discussed their dinner plans in Denver. The atmosphere was calm, professional, the kind of routine departure Maya had overseen hundreds of times before. That changed when Jessica Morton boarded. She was impeccably dressed in a designer suit, her blonde hair perfectly styled, wheeling a Louis Vuitton carry-on. Maya noticed her double take at the cockpit door, the slight narrowing of eyes, the way her manicured hand tightened on her boarding pass. "Excuse me," Jessica said, her voice carrying that particular tone Maya had learned to recognize over the years. Polite on the surface, but lined with steel underneath. "I think you're in the wrong place." The flight attendants are wearing different uniforms. Maya maintained her professional smile, one hand resting lightly on the cockpit door. "Good evening, ma'am. I'm Captain Thompson, and I'll be commanding your flight to Denver tonight." Jessica's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. "You're the pilot?" The question came out louder than necessary, drawing attention from other passengers. "Are you sure you're qualified for this aircraft?" The cabin fell silent. Maya could feel every eye on them, could sense First Officer Chun tensing beside her. 23 years of experience had taught her exactly how to handle this moment. "Ma'am, I have over 15,000 flight hours and have been commanding this aircraft type for 8 years, Maya replied, her voice calm and measured. "I can assure you that you're in very capable hands." "I'd like to speak to someone in charge," Jessica insisted, her voice rising. "Surely there must be some mistake. I frequently fly first class and I've never seen, well, a black female captain?" Maya completed the sentence, maintaining her professional demeanor. "We're still relatively rare, but I can assure you we're equally qualified." Other passengers had begun to react. A woman in 4C shook her head in disapproval at Jessica's behavior. The businessman in 2A had removed his headphones, watching the scene unfold with a frown. It was Barbara Chun, the lead flight attendant, who stepped forward. With 30 years of experience, she had a way of diffusing tension that seemed almost magical. "Ms. Morton," Barbara intervened smoothly, checking the passenger manifest. "Captain Thompson is one of our most experienced pilots. Would you like me to show you to your seat in 1A? We'll be serving pre-flight beverages shortly." Jessica's face had flushed red, finally registering the disapproving looks from other passengers. The elderly gentleman in 3F had half risen from his seat, clearly about to say something, but his wife placed a restraining hand on his arm. I simply wanted to ensure. Jessica's voice trailed off as she realized the indefensibility of her position. She allowed Barbara to guide her to her seat, her earlier confidence deflated. Maya maintained her position at the cockpit door, continuing to greet the remaining passengers with unshaken professionalism. Inside, she felt the familiar weight of these moments, the constant need to prove herself, to remain calm in the face of prejudice, to turn every confrontation into an opportunity for education rather than conflict. First Officer Chen leaned closer. "You handled that perfectly, Captain," he murmured. Maya gave a slight nod, her expression neutral, but her mind already calculating how this interaction might affect crew dynamics and passenger confidence during the flight. She'd learned long ago that her response to these situations didn't just impact the moment. It could influence perceptions far beyond the confines of this aircraft. As the last passengers boarded, Maya could still feel Jessica's eyes on her from 1A, now filled with embarrassment rather than challenge. The incident had lasted barely 5 minutes, but its ripples would be felt throughout the flight. Maya knew from experience that what happened next would be crucial. How she commanded the flight, how she interacted with the crew, how she maintained her authority while fostering understanding. She took her place in the cockpit, beginning her pre-flight checks with practiced precision. Above all else, she was a pilot, and no amount of prejudice or preconception could change that fundamental truth. The sky, after all, didn't care about the color of your skin or your gender. It demanded only competence, respect, and understanding. The aftermath of the boarding incident rippled through the first-class cabin like waves in a still pond. As the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Maya could sense the shifting dynamics through the occasional reports from her cabin crew. Whispered conversations drifted between seats, punctuated by furtive glances toward both the cockpit and Jessica in 1A. It was Lily Chun, a 12-year-old traveling with her father Marcus in 2D and 2F, who first broke the uncomfortable atmosphere. During one of Maya's brief walks through the cabin, a habit she maintained to establish a commanding yet approachable presence, Lily's hand shot up with the directness only children can muster. "Captain Thompson?" Lily's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "How fast are we flying right now?" Maya paused, noting how Marcus Chun, no relation to her first officer, she learned, watched the interaction carefully. "We're cruising at about 550 miles per hour, she answered, smiling at Lily's wide-eyed response. "That's about 8 miles every minute." "Dad, that's faster than your Ferrari," Lily exclaimed, causing several nearby passengers to chuckle, including Barbara, who was serving drinks nearby. Marcus, a corporate executive based on his earlier conversation with Barbara, leaned forward. "Captain, I hope you'll forgive my daughter's enthusiasm. She's been interested in aviation since she could walk." "Nothing to forgive," Maya replied warmly. Curiosity is the first step toward learning. She noticed Jessica shifting uncomfortably in her seat, clearly listening to every word. Lily's next question came in a lower voice, but still carried clearly. "Is it hard being a pilot when some people don't think you should be one?" The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Marcus started to shush his daughter, but Maya raised a hand gently. "It's a fair question," she said, aware that every passenger was listening. "Any challenging career is harder when you have to prove yourself constantly. But that's why it's so important to excel, to show that capability isn't limited by gender or race." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "We've been working on similar issues in my company," he offered. "Tech industry has its own diversity challenges. Sometimes it takes seeing excellence in unexpected places to challenge our preconceptions." From her seat, Jessica seemed to sink deeper into her magazine, though Maya noticed she hadn't turned a page in several minutes. Barbara, ever the skilled diplomat, chose that moment to approach with the drink card. "Captain, would you like to share that story about your first solo flight? The one that inspired that group of students last month?" Maya recognized Barbara's subtle orchestration, creating a space for connection rather than confrontation. As she shared the story of her first solo flight, complete with the nervous excitement and triumph, she watched the cabin's atmosphere transform. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen now turned openly toward her. A woman in 3C, who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Williams, shared her own experiences as one of few female neurosurgeons in her hospital. Marcus spoke about his company's mentorship program for underrepresented groups in tech. Even the elderly couple in 3D and 3F had a story about their granddaughter breaking barriers in marine biology. The conversation flowed naturally, weaving between professional challenges and personal triumphs. Maya noticed Jessica's magazine slowly lowering, her attention caught by the authentic exchanges happening around her. Lily, still full of questions, asked about flight school requirements and training paths. Maya found herself drawing on her years of experience to offer guidance, aware that her words might shape this young girl's future dreams. "The sky doesn't care who you are," Maya told Lily, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It only cares about respect, preparation, and dedication. Remember that whenever someone tells you what you can't do." Barbara, moving efficiently through the cabin, managed to include Jessica in the conversation by asking about her own career journey in investment banking. It was a masterful display of how to bring someone from the periphery into the circle, allowing Jessica to contribute positively to the discussion rather than remain isolated in her earlier embarrassment. As the conversations continued, Maya observed the subtle but significant shift in the cabin's atmosphere. What had started as tension had transformed into a kind of impromptu community, united by shared experiences and challenges. Even those passengers who hadn't spoken seemed moved by the authentic exchanges. Before returning to the cockpit, Maya caught Barbara's eye and nodded in appreciation. Sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice wasn't confrontation, but connection, creating spaces where understanding could grow naturally. The incident that had started their flight wasn't forgotten, but it had evolved into something more valuable, a catalyst for genuine dialogue about change, opportunity, and the power of challenging assumptions. As Maya resumed her position in the cockpit, she could hear Lily's excited voice still asking questions about aviation, while Marcus engaged nearby passengers in a discussion about corporate diversity initiatives. In the confined space of an aircraft at 36,000 feet, small moments could lead to lasting changes in perspective. Maya knew from experience that these conversations, these connections, were how progress was made. One flight, one person, one shifted perspective at a time. Halfway through the flight to Denver, Maya found herself in an unexpected teaching session during her rest period. The cockpit door was secure with First Officer Chun at the controls, while she took the opportunity to engage with passengers who had expressed interest in aviation. The first-class cabin had transformed into an impromptu classroom, with Lily at the center of the group. "So the wings create lift because of something called Bernoulli's principle?" Lily asked, carefully drawing diagrams in her notebook as Maya explained the basics of aerodynamics. "Exactly," Maya smiled, using a paper napkin to demonstrate the airflow. "The curved upper surface of the wing makes air travel faster over the top than the bottom, creating a pressure difference that lifts the aircraft." She noticed Marcus watching with genuine interest, his laptop closed for the first time since takeoff. "It's not unlike business principles," Marcus contributed, his corporate perspective adding an interesting dimension. "Success often comes from understanding and utilizing natural forces rather than fighting against them. Though I must admit, our diversity initiatives felt more like swimming upstream at first." Maya nodded, recognizing the parallel. "Change usually does. When I started flying 23 years ago, the resistance was palpable." She glanced briefly at Jessica, who had been quietly listening from her seat. "But like aerodynamics, once you understand the principles of change, you can work with them rather than against them." The mention of her early career triggered a vivid memory. Maya found herself back in a simulator session from 2001, where an instructor had deliberately set her up to fail, creating scenarios far more challenging than those given to her male colleagues. Instead of breaking under the pressure, she had excelled, turning each challenge into an opportunity to prove her exceptional skills. "I remember a flight from Paris," Maya shared, noting how Jessica had shifted to listen more intently. "A passenger refused to board when he saw me in the cockpit. The gate agent offered to rebook him on another flight, but his teenage daughter refused to leave. She said she'd never seen a black female pilot before, and she wasn't going to miss the chance to fly with one. Lily's eyes sparkled. What happened? He boarded, Maya smiled. And by the end of the flight, he came to the cockpit to apologize. His daughter had spent the entire flight telling him about Katherine Johnson, Bessie Coleman, and other pioneering women in aviation. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones we least expect. Jessica spoke up for the first time since the boarding incident, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than challenge. How did you handle it? The constant questioning? Maya considered her response carefully. By understanding that each interaction was an opportunity, every successful flight, every smooth landing, every professional response to doubt, they all contributed to changing perceptions. Not just about me, but about what's possible for everyone who comes after. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. We've seen similar patterns in tech. The first few women and minorities in leadership positions face intense scrutiny, but they pave the way for others. Though I'm realizing now we could be doing much more to support that transition. The key, Maya explained, is understanding that change happens in moments like these, in conversations, in small revelations, in the quiet recognition of our shared humanity. She turned to Lily, who was still sketching aircraft designs. And it happens when young people like you dream without limits. Jessica's next question surprised everyone. What would you tell someone who might have let their preconceptions cloud their judgment? The cabin grew quiet. Maya recognized this moment for what it was, a bridge being built, a perspective shifting. I'd say that growth comes from acknowledging our biases and choosing to learn from them. Every person in aviation, myself included, is constantly learning and evolving. As if to demonstrate this point, Barbara appeared with a fresh round of coffee, smoothly integrating herself into the conversation. She shared her own 30 years of observations about changing attitudes in the industry, adding depth to the discussion. You know, Marcus mused, typing notes into his phone. We could implement some of these principles in our corporate training programs. The power of personal stories, the importance of visible representation. Lily, who had been quiet for a moment, looked up from her notebook. Captain Thompson, would you be willing to speak at my school's career day? There are other girls who should hear these stories. Maya felt the weight of the request. Another opportunity to shape young minds, to continue the work of those who had paved the way for her. I'd be honored, Lily, because every time we share these experiences, we help someone else imagine new possibilities for themselves. The teaching session had evolved far beyond basic flight principles, touching on deeper truths about courage, perseverance, and the power of understanding. As Maya prepared to return to the cockpit, she noticed Jessica writing something in her planner, Marcus deep in thought over his notes, and Lily adding final touches to her aircraft designs. Each processing the conversation in their own way, each changed by this shared experience at 36,000 feet. Back in the cockpit, Maya settled into her captain's seat, her hands automatically moving through the instrument checks while her mind processed the conversations from the cabin. First Officer Ching gave her a knowing look. He'd heard similar discussions throughout their years flying together. The autopilot held their course steady as city lights twinkled far below, creating rivers of gold through the darkness. In these quiet moments, when the white noise of the engines filled the background, Maya often found herself reflecting on the weight she carried, not just as a pilot, but as a symbol. Sometimes, she thought, watching the altimeter hold steady at 36,000 feet, I wonder if I can just be Maya Thompson, pilot, without being Maya Thompson, the black female captain who broke barriers. The thought brought a familiar ache, one she rarely shared with others. Her mind drifted to a conversation with her wife, Elena, just last week. You don't always have to be the teacher, Elena had said, massaging Maya's tense shoulders after a particularly challenging flight. You don't owe everyone an education. But didn't she? The memory of her own struggle surfaced. The flight school instructor who'd suggested she'd be more comfortable as a flight attendant. The countless passengers who'd done double takes at the sight of her in command. The subtle ways some crew members had questioned her authority in her early days as captain. Each victory had come with its own price. The emotional energy required to maintain professionalism in the face of doubt, to turn every challenge into a teaching moment, to carry the hopes and dreams of those who saw themselves in her success. It was a weight that never truly lifted. Maya remembered her first day as a captain, standing proud in her new uniform with 4 stripes gleaming on her shoulders. That same day, a senior pilot had walked past her in the terminal and loudly asked if it was costume day. She had maintained her dignity, responded with a smile and a firm correction, but the sting of that moment still lingered. Request permission to deviate 10 degrees right for weather. First Officer Chin's voice brought her back to the present. Maya checked the radar, noting the storm cell they were avoiding. Permission granted, she responded, watching the course adjustment on a navigation display. The professionalism of aviation offered a refuge. In the cockpit, procedures and protocols created a clear framework where expertise spoke louder than prejudice. Yet even here, the weight of representation followed. Every decision she made, every radio call, every landing, they all carried the added pressure of knowing that her performance would affect perceptions of other minority pilots who would follow. One mistake wouldn't just be a mistake. It would become ammunition for those who questioned diversity in aviation. The conversation with Lily and the others in the cabin had been rewarding, yes, but Maya felt the familiar exhaustion that came from sharing her story, from being vulnerable while maintaining professional boundaries, from carrying the mantle of role model while simply trying to do her job. She thought of the countless times she'd been asked to speak at aviation schools, to mentor aspiring pilots, to share her journey at industry events. Each request came with an implicit understanding that her story could inspire change, could open doors for others. The responsibility was both an honor and a burden. "You make it look easy," Barbara had once told her. "The way you handle the difficult moments, the way you teach without preaching." But it wasn't easy. Each interaction required careful calibration, being firm but not angry, educational but not confrontational, authentic but always professional. The cost of this constant balance showed in subtle ways. The extra hour she needed to decompress after flights, the careful consideration she gave to every public interaction, the way she monitored her tone and expression even in moments of justified frustration. Yet as she watched the sunset paint the clouds in brilliant oranges and pinks, Maya acknowledged that this was part of her journey. Just as the pioneers before her had carried their own burdens to create opportunities for her generation, she carried this weight to ease the path for those who would follow. A message from ground control about their approach to Denver brought her focus back to the immediate task. Maya straightened in her seat, feeling the familiar sense of purpose that came with command. Yes, the weight of representation was heavy, but it had also made her stronger, more resilient, more capable of navigating both the complexities of flight and the challenges of change. In the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson she could share. Not just how to handle discrimination or break barriers, but how to find strength in the journey itself, how to turn the weight of responsibility into wings of change. The Denver skyline glowed against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains as Maya guided the aircraft through its final approach. The landing was butter smooth, a satisfying end to a flight that had become far more than just another journey from point A to point B. Denver International Airport at midnight had its own peculiar beauty. The vast terminal, usually bustling with travelers, had settled into a hushed quiet broken only by the occasional announcement echoing through empty corridors. The famous white peaks of the terminal roof cast dramatic shadows under the moonlight streaming through massive windows. As Maya walked through the quiet concourse, her pilot's case rolling behind her, she noticed how different airports felt at this hour. During the day, they were places of constant motion and energy. At night, they became almost contemplative spaces, where the remnants of thousands of journeys lingered in the still air. The physical exhaustion of the long day had settled deep into her bones, but it was the emotional fatigue that weighed heaviest. Each step toward the parking garage seemed to require more energy than the last. The conversations with Lily, Marcus, and Jessica played on repeat in her mind, along with countless similar interactions from years past. Her car sat alone in the pilot section of the garage, its familiar shape a welcome sight. As Maya settled into the driver's seat, she allowed herself a moment of complete stillness, something rarely afforded during the demanding hours of flight. The leather seat cradled her tired body as she closed her eyes, taking deep breaths of the cool Colorado night air. The drive home took her through Denver's sleeping streets. Traffic lights cycled through their colors for almost nobody, and the city's lights painted the sky in a soft urban glow. Along empty boulevards and past darkened office buildings, Maya processed the day's events. The initial confrontation with Jessica seemed almost distant now, transformed by the conversations that followed. At a red light, she checked her phone. 3 messages from Elena. One asking about dinner, long since irrelevant. Another about the milk, still needed. And a third simply saying, "Love you." Hope today was kind. Maya smiled at her wife's intuition. Elena always seemed to know when days would be challenging. There were also emails from her airline's Diversity Initiative Committee, requesting her participation in an upcoming panel discussion, and one from her union representative following up on a policy proposal she'd submitted about crew inclusion training. The work never really stopped. The familiar streets of her neighborhood appeared, lined with sleeping houses and the occasional prowling cat. Maya pulled into her driveway at 1:43 a.m., the house dark except for the porch light Elena always left on for her. Mrs. Torres, their elderly neighbor who somehow kept track of everyone's comings and goings, was still awake, a dim light visible through her kitchen window. As Maya collected her bags from the car, Mrs. Torres appeared at her fence. "Rough flight, mi cielo," she called softly, her accent thick with concern. "I made you my special tamales. They're in your kitchen." Maya felt a wave of gratitude for this small kindness. "You're an angel, Mrs. Torres." "Thank you." Inside, the house welcomed her with familiar shadows and the soft whir of the heating system. Before she could even set down her bags, Mozart, their massive Maine Coon cat, appeared, wrapping himself around her legs with a rumbling purr. His presence, as always, helped ground her after the emotional highs and lows of flight. In the kitchen, true to Mrs. Torres's word, a covered plate of tamales waited on the counter, along with a note from Elena. Heated them up before bed. "Wake me if you need to talk." Heart suit. Maya settled into her favorite armchair, Mozart immediately claiming her lap. The house's quiet wrapped around her like a blanket as she sipped chamomile tea and allowed herself to fully process the day. The young girl's eager questions about aviation, Marcus's awakening to systemic issues, Jessica's journey from confrontation to curiosity. Each interaction represented a small step toward change. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, marking time in a world that seemed suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. Maya thought about all the other pilots like her, sitting in quiet rooms across the country, carrying similar burdens and hopes. They were all part of a longer journey, one that extended far beyond individual flights or personal victories. Mozart's purring grew louder as she scratched behind his ears, his simple affection asking nothing of her beyond this moment. Here, in the peaceful darkness of her home, Maya could finally let go of Captain Thompson and just be herself, tired, fulfilled, and ready for whatever tomorrow's flight would bring. Dawn broke over Denver, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold as Maya began her morning routine. The quiet hours before flight were sacred, a time for preparation, both physical and mental. As she pressed her uniform with practiced precision, each crease sharp and intentional, Maya contemplated the changes yesterday's flight had inspired. Her captain's stripes caught the morning light as she hung the freshly pressed uniform. 23 years in aviation had taught her much, but perhaps the most valuable lesson was knowing when to evolve, when to break old patterns of response. At her home office desk, Maya reviewed her flight plan for the day while composing these responses. Each message represented a different facet of her evolving approach to advocacy and education. Gone were the days of simply enduring or diplomatically deflecting. She had learned to transform these moments into opportunities for lasting change. The HR email was particularly important. Rather than filing a standard incident report, Maya chose to frame it as a chance to improve training and support systems. It was about breaking the pattern of reactive responses and moving toward proactive solutions. Her note to Jessica required careful consideration. Maya wanted to acknowledge the growth she'd witnessed without minimizing the initial confrontation. The goal wasn't to shame, but to build bridges, to create openings for further understanding. The guidance for Marcus focused on practical applications, turning yesterday's conversations into actionable steps for corporate change. His genuine interest in improving his company's diversity initiatives deserved thoughtful support. As Maya packed her flight bag, she reflected on how her approach to these situations had evolved. Early in her career, she had felt obligated to serve as an educator in every challenging situation, often at great personal cost. Now, she understood the importance of boundaries, of choosing when and how to engage. It's about sustainable advocacy, she had told a group of young pilots last month. You can't pour from an empty cup. This morning's responses reflected that philosophy, measured, purposeful engagement rather than exhausting emotional labor. The morning sun filled her office as she finished her preparations. Her reflection in the window showed not just Captain Thompson in her crisp uniform, but Maya, whole, authentic, and increasingly comfortable with the complexity of her role as both aviator and advocate. Her phone buzzed with a message from Elena. Ready to soar, my love? Maya smiled, gathering her things. Yes, she was ready, not just to fly, but to continue breaking patterns, setting boundaries, and maintaining her authenticity in an industry still learning to embrace change. Each flight was an opportunity to write a new chapter in aviation's ongoing story of transformation. The pre-dawn quiet of Denver International Airport wrapped around Maya as she strode through the terminal, her presence drawing respectful nods from ground crew and fellow pilots. Today's flight would take her back to Chicago, completing the circle of her journey. But something was different. She carried herself with a renewed sense of purpose, a subtle shift in her professional bearing that reflected yesterday's transformative experiences. In the cockpit, Maya moved through her pre-flight checks with practiced precision, each action flowing naturally from years of experience. Her new first officer, Sarah Martinez, watched with quiet admiration. Maya's reputation for technical excellence had preceded her. Captain Thompson, Sarah began, I requested this rotation specifically. Your handling of yesterday's situation has already become a talking point in pilot circles. Maya smiled slightly, continuing her systematic check of the aircraft systems. The best lessons often come from our most challenging moments, First Officer Martinez. Watch our fuel transfer indicators. There's a subtle fluctuation that tells you everything you need to know about system health. The morning light was just beginning to touch the horizon as they completed their preparations. Maya's leadership style had evolved over the years into something uniquely her own. Technical mastery blended with emotional intelligence, authority tempered with accessibility. The crew responded to her quiet confidence with efficient professionalism. Ground control, this is United 2187, requesting pushback clearance. Maya spoke in her headset, her voice carrying the natural authority that came not just from rank but from absolute competence. The response was immediate and respectful. As they taxied toward the runway, Maya felt the familiar sense of rightness that came with command. Here, in the cockpit, every action was a demonstration of professional mastery. The complex dance of instruments, procedures, and human coordination flowed through her like a well-rehearsed symphony. The takeoff roll began, and Maya felt the aircraft respond to her touch. The moment of rotation always brought a subtle joy, that perfect instant when human intention and mechanical capability merged to defeat gravity. The Denver skyline fell away below them as they climbed through the morning air. At cruise altitude, above a carpet of clouds that stretched to the horizon, Maya found her center. Up here, the complexities of ground-based prejudices seemed distant. The sky demanded excellence without regard for gender or race. It was the ultimate meritocracy. Beautiful morning up here, Sarah commented, checking their navigation displays. It always is, Maya replied, thinking of all the dawns she'd witnessed from this vantage point. You know, Sarah, there's something about flying that strips away everything except what truly matters: skill, judgment, responsibility. The sun painted the cloud tops golden as they continued east. Maya reflected on how her relationship with flying had evolved. Early in her career, each flight had felt like a test to be passed, a challenge to be overcome. Now it was different. She had found peace in her mastery, confidence in her identity not just as a pilot, but as a leader who happened to fly. The aircraft systems hummed in perfect harmony, responding to her subtle adjustments. This was more than professional fulfillment. It was a personal victory over every doubt, every obstacle, every preconception she'd faced. She had not just survived in aviation. She had helped transform it, one flight at a time. "Captain," Sarah's voice broke into her thoughts. "Maintenance wants to know about that subtle fuel fluctuation you mentioned." Maya nodded, already pulling up the relevant data. This was where she thrived, in the perfect balance of technical expertise and leadership, where her authority came not from her stripes, but from her absolute command of her profession. Above the clouds, in the clear morning air, Maya Thompson was simply a captain at peace with her place in the sky. The journey had been long, but she had arrived exactly where she was meant to be. 3 months after that pivotal flight, Maya sat in her home office, reviewing emails that traced the ripples of change spreading outward from that day. Jessica Morton's message particularly caught her attention. She had joined a local Women in Aviation chapter and was organizing STEM events for young girls interested in aerospace careers. The transformation from confrontation to advocacy was remarkable. Marcus Chun had followed through on his promises. His tech company had launched a comprehensive diversity initiative, using lessons learned from aviation to reshape corporate culture. He'd even invited Maya to speak at their leadership summit, creating unexpected bridges between industries. Lily's weekly updates brought constant joy. The young girl had started flight lessons, her enthusiasm undimmed by the challenges ahead. Her parents had become vocal supporters of aviation diversity programs, their influence spreading through their professional networks. The airline's response had exceeded Maya's hopes. Her recommendations had led to substantial policy updates, with new training modules specifically addressing unconscious bias and promoting inclusive leadership. The changes were being noticed industry-wide, with other carriers beginning to implement similar programs. Maya's inbox now regularly filled with speaking requests and mentorship opportunities. She chose them carefully, maintaining the balance she'd fought so hard to achieve. Her approach to advocacy had evolved, more strategic, more sustainable, and ultimately more effective. "You've started something bigger than yourself," Elena had observed one evening, watching Maya prepare for a keynote address at the National Aviation Conference. The truth of those words resonated deeply. What had begun as personal challenges had transformed into a movement for institutional change. The industry discussions had shifted too. Maya was no longer a lone voice calling for change. She was part of a growing chorus of leaders working to reshape aviation's future. The conversations had moved beyond simple representation to deeper questions of systemic transformation and sustainable inclusion. In quiet moments between flights, Maya reflected on her journey. The weight of representation hadn't lessened, but she had grown stronger in carrying it. She had found a way to be both mentor and captain, advocate and aviator, without sacrificing either role. The future stretched before her like an open sky, full of possibility. New pilots were entering the profession with different expectations, finding more support and fewer barriers. The pattern was finally breaking, not just for one flight or one crew, but for an entire industry. As she prepared for her next flight, Maya thought of all the young eyes watching her, all the doors slowly opening, all the changes still to come. Her legacy wasn't just in the flights she commanded or the barriers she broke. It was in the transformation she inspired in others, the ripples that would continue long after she made her final landing. The morning sun caught her captain's stripes as she straightened her uniform. Another day, another flight, another chance to show that the sky truly belongs to everyone who dares to claim it. Maya Thompson, captain, mentor, and catalyst for change, was ready for whatever challenges awaited above the clouds.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.